I know that the ones who love us will miss us.
Think about that for a moment. Not a philosopher who said that, not a poet. A man who had every reason to be angry at the world. A man who had lost more than most people could survive losing. And when someone asked him what happens when we die, that was his answer. Not theology, not philosophy, just the quiet awareness of someone who already knew what it felt like to be the one left behind. But before we get there, before we get to the losses that shaped everything, there's a story that almost nobody knows. A story that starts long before the fame, long before the world knew his name, in a place where a little boy was already learning what it meant to be left. But this isn't just a story about someone who suffered. Those stories are everywhere. This one is different because most people who carry this much pain become hard, closed, bitter, defined by what they lost. He became something else entirely. And here's the question nobody ever really answers when they talk about him. How? How do you lose everything, not once, but twice, and still choose to be kind? That's not a small question. That's the whole story. And the answer is not what you'd expect. Before anyone knew his name, he was just a boy who kept having to start over. Born in Beirut, moved to Australia, then New York, then Toronto. Every time he started to belong somewhere, they moved again. Every time he found his footing, the ground shifted. And through all of it, his father was nowhere. He had left when the boy was 3, not because of circumstance, not because of tragedy. He just left. And the boy grew up carrying that silence like a weight he couldn't put down. He struggled in school, changed schools constantly, was told he wasn't good enough in almost every room he entered. The one place he felt free was the ice. Hockey gave him something nothing else could: a team, a purpose, a place where it didn't matter where you came from or who your father was. And then at 14, an injury took that away too. So he left school, worked 3 jobs, sharpened skates, cut bushes, cooked in a restaurant. Just a kid trying to find a reason to keep going. But 2 things kept him alive in those years: his sister, Kim, and eventually, the camera. Because somewhere in the middle of all that starting over, he discovered that he could become other people. And for a boy who had never quite fit into his own life, that was everything. So he chased it. All the way to Los Angeles, all the way to the edges of what seemed possible. And for a while, it looked like the story was finally going to go his way. And in many ways, it did. The roles started coming. The world started paying attention. And somewhere along the way, he found his people. River Phoenix was the first real friend he had ever had. Not a colleague, not someone who wanted something, a friend. Someone who understood what it meant to grow up without solid ground beneath you. They were different in almost every way. But they recognized something in each other that neither of them had words for. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. Then on October 31st, 1993, River was gone, drug overdose, 23 years old. And he said something afterwards that stayed with everyone who heard it. I was very sad, and something beyond sad. I don't know what it is, just that you sob for hours. He didn't have language for it. because there isn't any. He buried the grief the only way he knew how. He worked. And then, just when things were starting to feel possible again, his sister Kim was diagnosed with leukemia. The same sister who had moved from country to country with him. The same sister who had been the one constant in a life full of change. He didn't announce it, didn't talk about it, didn't ask for sympathy. He just quietly stepped back from everything and was there for her. He founded a cancer fund in silence, spent millions fighting the disease without telling a soul, because that's who he was. Not someone who needed the world to know he was doing the right thing, just someone who did it. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, he met Jennifer. And for the first time in years, something felt like hope. Jennifer was different, not because of where she came from or what she did, but because of how she made him feel, like the ground was finally solid, like the boy who had spent his whole life starting over had finally found somewhere to stay. They built something together, quiet, real, away from the cameras and the noise. And then she told him she was pregnant. And for the first time in his life, he allowed himself to believe that everything was going to be okay. He prepared everything, a nursery, a name, Ava, his daughter, and then one night the phone rang. Jennifer was sobbing so hard he could barely understand her. He only knew that something had happened to their daughter. He flew back immediately, but there was nothing to fly back to. Ava was gone, born still on Christmas Eve, and the world that had finally started to feel like home collapsed. They tried to hold each other together, but grief is a weight that sometimes pulls two people in opposite directions. They separated. He gave away everything in the nursery to people who needed it because he couldn't look at it. He threw himself into work, into speed, into anything that kept him from standing still long enough to feel it. And then, 18 months later, the phone rang again. Jennifer was gone. A car accident, April 2nd, 2001, 28 years old, and they buried her next to their daughter. The two people he had allowed himself to love most in the same ground, side by side, and he went silent. Not for days, not for weeks, for years. And the man who went silent, who buried his daughter and the woman he loved in the same ground, who had lost his best friend years before, who had spent years fighting for his sister's life in silence, who had grown up without a father, who had started over in country after country, carrying all of it without ever asking the world to notice, wasn't just anyone. That man was Keanu Reeves. And after the silence, he didn't explode. He didn't collapse publicly. He didn't perform his grief for anyone. He just kept going, and the work kept coming. Not because he was chasing fame, because it was the only place where the noise in his head went quiet. But here's what most people forget. While he was carrying all of that, he was also becoming one of the most iconic actors in the history of cinema. The Matrix changed everything, not just for him, for an entire generation. A film that made the world question reality itself. And he was at the center of it. Neo, the One. A role that almost went to 5 other actors before it found him. A role that only worked because of who he was, not just as an actor, but as a person. Quiet, present, completely committed. He trained for months with a broken spine, performed stunts that should have been impossible, showed up every single day as someone who had nothing to prove and proved everything. And when it was over, he gave his profits away, quietly, without announcement, because that's who he was. But the years that followed were not easy. Films that didn't work. A career that seemed to be losing momentum. A man still living in hotel rooms because he didn't see the point in building something permanent in a world that had taught him how quickly things disappear. And then a script arrived. A man who had lost his wife, who had lost everything, who had nothing left to lose. Most actors would have researched the grief, would have studied it from the outside. He didn't need to. I love his grief. I relate to that. Grief and loss don't ever go away. He wasn't acting. He was excavating, pulling something real from the deepest part of everything he had lived through and putting it on screen. And the world felt it. John Wick became one of the most beloved action franchises in history, not because of the fight choreography, but because somewhere underneath all of it, there was a man in real pain playing a man in real pain. And audiences knew the difference, even if they couldn't explain why. And somewhere in the middle of all that rising, the things he had almost given up on started coming back. His sister Kim, the same sister he had fought for in silence for years, went into remission. No announcement, no celebration for the cameras, just a brother and a sister who had been through everything together, finally breathing again. And he kept showing up for the people around him, the crew members he shook hands with every single morning on set, the stuntmen he bought motorcycles for at the end of filming, the strangers he sat next to on the subway, the fans he stopped for on the street. Not because someone was watching, not because it was good for his image, but because somewhere in the middle of all that loss, he had made a quiet decision that if the world was going to keep taking things from him, he was going to keep giving anyway. And then Alexandra came, not dramatically, not suddenly, just quietly, the way the right things tend to arrive after you've stopped looking. A collaborator first, a friend, and then something more. For the first time in almost 2 decades, he let someone in. And the man who had lived in hotel rooms for years finally came home. There's a version of this story where he doesn't make it, where the losses stack up too high to climb over, where the boy who grew up without a father, who lost his best friend, who buried his daughter, and the woman he loved in the same ground, just stops. That version almost happened, but he made a choice, not to be defined by what was taken from him, but by what he chose to give in return. The handshakes every morning on set, the motorcycles for the stuntmen, the strangers on the subway, the millions donated in silence. So, if you're carrying something the world doesn't know about, if you've lost something you never got to properly grieve, remember this. The heaviest hearts sometimes build the gentlest people, and the world needs gentle people more than it will ever admit. Sometimes the place that breaks you open is exactly where the real story begins. That's the story of Keanu Reeves. This is before they knew. See you next time.